Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And if you can't tell from that expensive-looking green screen behind me, I am currently on vacation a little bit. Again, reviews might be a little bit sporadic, but I wanted to get something out of here because I did listen to a bunch of albums. And hey, the schedule does not stop, so let's get on the pulse. So I've gone on the record before that there are certain types of metal, specifically of the death and doom variety, that are just not my thing. I get the appeal. I've certainly been around a lot of friends who like this particular style of caveman riff, but for me, it doesn't always click, and thus going into Primitive Man, I will say I was pleasantly surprised for the moments that worked, but not entirely surprised that as a whole it didn't quite get all the way there for me. I've often found some of their projects to be a little too grinding and long, often a little underwritten in spots, and again, while I appreciate some of the textural appeal, that can only take you so far. And thus going into Immersion, which was a little bit tighter, brought in some elements of noise, brought some of the sludgier elements back, and even hints of tremolo riffing, I can appreciate what they're doing, but I'm still not all the way there on this band. For one, a lot of the songs seem to really stay on a static, grinding tone for a long time, and don't really have the same sort of variance in groove or percussion to really grab me. And again, a lot of these songs become kind of melodically stale really quickly. But what I find even more frustrating is the songwriting, because a band like this, oftentimes you wouldn't rely upon some of the writing or lyrics to really put them over the top, but it would certainly help differentiate the sound. Whereas a lot of this defaults to a lot of pretty basic nihilism, and while there are interesting ideas, just the swirling form of being engulfed in chaos, or just the depravity of humans' failure, yeah, it's pretty by the numbers, but it's often performed decently well. One thing, though, that I found kind of distracting is that, and this is going to sound kind of hilarious, I don't think the profanity in this writing works at all. It comes across as very basic and bro metal for this sort of style, and yes, there's always going to be some crossover in that coming in certain parts of death metal, but this, it's trying to take itself a little bit more seriously, or at least have that flat one-dimensional tone, and going for that sound does not flatter it whatsoever. I don't know. I get the feeling this is going to be entirely up some folks' alley. This is a band that's got that one trick that they nail pretty impressively if you're into that trick, but I'm just not. None of that, really. I get the appeal, but it's not for me, so light 6 out of 10. If this is your thing or if what I've described is up your alley, give it a chance. Check it out. And while we're on the subject of genres that are not my thing, we've got metalcore here. Now, to be fair, I've talked about this a number of times, the genre's just not normally my thing, and I don't have the deepest depth within it, and thus hearing something about Misery Signals, a Canadian-American act that reportedly had a seminal album within the genre, actually got me a little curious. So, I went back, I listened through their back catalog, and it's a whole lot of metalcore, but I will say their project Controller, produced by Devin Townsend of all people, was actually pretty great. Still not my kind of genre, but they got a little bit more sweeping and melodic and more interesting, and yeah, I see why it's considered a pretty great project. Now, the key thing to note with that is that that was part of a series of albums that came out in the latter half of the 2000s that, sure, were very good, but also featured a different lead vocalist, and thus now switching things up. After a very long hiatus, they're back to their original vocalist, who, I'll be honest, I never found all that dynamic or interesting, and thus we've got another metalcore album. It's not bad per se. If you like this sort of melodic metalcore, it'll probably be up your alley. The vocals are crunchy, the hooks are mostly there. The songs do get in your face. There are some interesting sweeping textures that are left over from the Townsend era, at least that he was producing, although not nearly as huge or impressive. But I think the bigger problem here is that it just doesn't stand out that much, especially when you get to the content. A lot of it is in broad, aspirational focus, trying to balance out between hitting the highs of your ambition but flying potentially too close to the sun, but also having that ambition and continuing forward. And sure, it's fine, but I've heard a lot of metalcore already, and this does not stand out, especially in comparison with a larger back catalog. It has the feel of a comeback release, in that it's got a lot of the stuff that will bring the diehards in, but if you're not a diehard, I don't see a lot of this really sticking out for me. Okay, you know what, for what it is, again, it's not my thing. I'm thinking an extremely light 6 out of 10, mostly saved by the final couple songs actually being pretty melodically diverse and pretty solid overall. But otherwise, I'm not going to remember much of this. Sorry. Okay, for those of you wondering what sort of grindcore, hardcore music, or even metalcore that I could really get into, y'all should be checking out this group called Gulch. I'd argue they're probably closest to hardcore punk, and when I say hardcore, I'm talking about the thick, pulsating, grinding low end that you hear out of, let's say, early SST projects, and with the sort of visceral, howled, screamed vocals that can ride those thick, pulsating, hammering grooves. There's a filthiness, but also a coursing power to a lot of these songs that, even though this album runs about 15 minutes long, there's hooks here. There's actual propulsive energy here. This is a project that has a short length but is packed to the gills with intensity. Now, some people would make the argument that, okay, it's just going for meathead, beat your brains out music that's intended to mosh to, and then you start getting into the content, where I'd argue there's a lot more of a primal intensity that comes to a lot of the writing. It's intense. There's a lot of things going on in said skull that you're trying to leak out in the face of the primal horrors around you. And go even further, you can argue that while you might want to try to fuck your way through the pain in a larger, entrenched, broken system around you where you're inevitably going to be tumbling down, might be all you can do. Now, I will say, an album like this, there's not much you can do to improve upon it. It's pretty direct in a lot of its appeal. But I will say that there was some richer, heavier, crunchier textures that were even a little bit more filthy on their 2018 EP. I find this a bit cleaner in spots, but on the flip side, if you're going to end the project with a cover of a Susie and the Banshees song and you do it this well, proving that you can slow down a little bit more and still maintain that visceral appeal, yeah, I'm on board. This absolutely fucking wrecks. So, solid 8 out of 10. For those of you who are into hardcore and metalcore and you want something that's this punishing, check this out.
And there ain't no glory in the west. No, there ain't no glory in the west.
You know, I didn't talk about Orville Peck when I discovered him on Bandcamp with Pony. Honestly, before a lot of the critics jumped on board in a big way when they started hearing a lot of his sound, which I will say did spark some interest. Here's this gay Canadian cowboy who's stepping out with a very interesting, smoked out, traditional country sound. I'd almost say is adjacent to dream country in some of its atmospheric tones. And you know what? That sort of thing should be entirely up my alley, and thus it's a little awkward when I come here and say that I didn't really love Pony as much as everyone else did. It's kind of tough to pin down why, too. I think some of it comes down to Orville Peck's delivery. He's got this very throaty, old-school singer-songwriter sound that you would get out of, like, 50s and 60s traditional country, and I like that tone. It feels theatrical. And when juxtaposed against sounds that are more organic and weirdly lacking in groove in spots, it left me a lot colder on Pony than I really wanted to be. It was a frustrating listen, and thus going into this shorter EP, Show Pony, still kind of frustrating in that I want to like this more than I do. I do think that a lot of the same sounds basically fall into the same issues I had before. It's got that thicker, warmer country timbre, a little smoked out in spots, but kind of lacking that underlying groove that I'd like to see come forward. Honestly, this is an album that really could use some rollicking presence. Overall, I like his delivery, and he's got the soulful tinges that come through on some songs like Drive Me Crazy, but I do think there are two major missteps on this EP that really come out to me. The first, the collaboration with Shania Twain. Yes, it might kind of make sense given that both these artists feel a little out of place when it comes to country at large, and they both have a theatrical style that kind of work, but they don't have a lot of chemistry, and I feel like the song trying to reinforce Lone Legacy just feels a little awkward, and really that comes across a lot of this album where it's very much focusing on that hardcore lone outlaw. And again, it feels a bit more theatrical than grounded in real texture. And while we're on that note, while I appreciate the subversion that comes through covering Fancy, you're not gonna beat Reba McEntire's cover. Hell, you're not gonna beat what Bobby Gentry did it originally. And the cover of it from Orville Peck, it's slowed down. It doesn't quite have the impact or swell or angry edge that came through in the original, and I'll admit, it just did not click for me whatsoever. Again, for fans of Orville Peck, this will probably be fine, but it does feel like a tacked on extra in comparison with a proper follow-up to Pony. If you like that, you'll be on board with this, totally, but I will say that I'm a little less enthused. To me, it's a 6 out of 10. If this is your thing, have fun with it, but I wish I liked this more than I do. Just saying.
Ain't that some shit? We're just small town hypocrites.
So, I'll admit I was kind of intrigued about this new Caylee Hammack album, specifically because a lot of the buzz was suggesting she'd be able to split the difference between the Nashville, more commercial side of things that would play her in the mainstream, but also some singer-songwriter instincts that would actually help her bring a little bit more detail and emotional nuance to her material. And going into her debut album, it's patchy, but I do see the potential. One thing I will not take away from her is that she is a vocal powerhouse. She's got that raw expressiveness that allows her to play in more subtle, more stripped back moments, but also belt her ass off, and I really do appreciate that. And there are songs here, like Small Town Hypocrite, that absolutely get there and bringing in some of that emotionally charged, complicated framing. At least doesn't help her look all that good, all things considered. And you know what? That actually works well for a fair bit of the content. You can tell that the overriding, not so much story, but emotional underpinning comes from a really bad breakup that she had from a very long-term relationship, and it colors a lot of songs here, but it also colors a lot of the emotional nuance in that, well, neither partner were entirely in the right, and that actually helps some of the framing of these songs come across a bit more nuanced and a bit more interesting. Hell, King Size Bed has a fair amount of smolder for as dark as it can get while still playing in this territory. Unfortunately, this is where we also have to bring up the fact that this is very much a Nashville creation in 2020, specifically in the production. Yes, I know Caylee Hammack is a primary contributor to a lot of the production here, but I'll also say that this project owes more than a bit to a lot of tones that are becoming popular from, say, Tennille Townes or Kelsey Ballerini, and owing a lot more to the pop country that would come out of that. Which isn't a bad thing, per se. It's different. It certainly emphasizes different vocal cadences and production textures, and unfortunately a certain clunkiness that doesn't always pay off the groove, but for the most part, it's alright. I will say that in her collaboration with Reba McEntire, it absolutely crystallized that this would be the sort of material if Reba had been making pop country in the 2020s instead of in the late 80s, early 90s. This could have been something she would have made, and I don't know how much I would have liked it one way or the other. I do prefer the older stuff that has a little bit more underlying groove, but this still is more organic than I was expecting. I will say this album does not end on a good note, and that did strike out to me, because it ends on a song that might as well be a somewhat continuation of what Maren Morris was doing with Rich. I know she's trying to be subversive with here, but I don't think Caylee Hammack quite sticks the landing with the satire, and it just comes across on a really poor note to end out the project. Still, it's not a bad album by any stretch. It's a promising debut. It shows a lot of flashes of potential. It reminds me a lot of the Tenille Townes album, and hell, on that note, I really wish that collaboration with Tenille Townes and Ashley McBryde had turned out more than some pretty lightweight aspirational material, but that's what happens when you get big name collabs. But as it is, there's promise here. I just wish it came together a little bit more, and in a very strong year for country, I'm gonna go with a strong 6 out of 10. If this scene in Nashville is up your alley, you're probably gonna have a lot of fun with it. As it is, not quite there for me, but it's got promise. I'm curious to hear more. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that anybody actually cared enough to ask for me to cover this album. Because, let's be real here, how many of you actually remember Hideaway by Kiesza? Better question, how many of you have cared about that song in the past 5 or 6 years since it dropped? Look, I'm in Canada, so we heard a little bit more of her. We actually heard a lot of her second single. But beyond that, there was a lot of house music that was coming around that time, especially if you were in that scene, as I kind of was, and her material just was not all that interesting. It felt kind of derivative, going back to the early 90s, and her album was just kind of wonky. She had some guest features that made no sense, like from Mick Jenkins and Joey Badass of all people. But okay, maybe the second question is, why haven't you heard of her since? Well, I hate to say it, but it's not exactly good news. She kind of got screwed by the record industry. I remember reading an article that called to mind a little bit of that. She also got stuck in a really bad car accident and took a long time to rehabilitate. All the press to her in the world that she was able to come back from that, that was impressive. So I figured I would give her next album a chance, 6 years removed from her first, and I wish I could say this was interesting. Unfortunately, like a lot of pop acts, she decided to hop on the 80s inspired bandwagon, specifically calling a lot from Carly Rae Jepsen's sound, except there's a lot of problems with Kiesza that haven't really gone away. For one, she's a powerful vocalist, but she's never mixed in a way that flatters her. And then going further from there, the grooves are not stellar. While she goes into more of a new wave vibe, it feels very thin. And when it's not thin, it's derivative as all hell from that era. And it's not like the content really jumps off the page. A lot of love songs that are passable, I guess, but not especially interesting. Look, if you're a fan of Kiesza, or if you've just been curious where she's been over the course of the past 5 years, this might be up your alley, but I'll be blunt, a lot of people probably did not care this came out, and going into this now with such a radical change of sound from what she was known for on her debut, I'm not sure this is gonna win her any more fans, so 5 out of 10, not my thing at all.
If you wanna get sunshine, moonlight, walking on the rooftop, moonlight, I'ma go get some time alone with you.
There is no easy way to talk about Jacob Collier. And for those of you who don't know, that might seem a little bit surprising, given that if you do a bit of research, you'll discover that he is apparently an experimental wonderkin in music as a composer and a multi-instrumentalist. And he works in electronic music and pop and R&B and soul and jazz and funk, and what can't this kid do? He's already won Grammys, for God's sakes. And to some extent that's all true. I do understand in terms of a composer, there is a layered complexity to a lot of what Jacob Collier puts together that has gotten him a lot of acclaim and clout from classical musicians or artists with that technician mindset to their music. But I'm using the word technician here specifically because Jacob Collier represents something that I've come across in art a fair bit that's often a little intangible and can really drive some fans off the wall, where you can tell that there is a certain level of focus on craftsmanship above everything else, to the point where some of the more intangible, emotional, soulful side seems to be sucked away. Now, this happens to a lot of artists who get burrowing into their own classical mindset, where they will like to pile on scale patterns or multi-syllabic rhymes. I'd honestly say this is a feature of Eminem's later career, where replay value has been sacrificed in favor of just piling up the rhymes instead of focusing on song structure or telling a good story. And to some extent, Jacob Collier kind of falls in a similar state. I think that he can compose very interesting songs, but it comes in neglecting a lot of his production, which can often feel very sterile and airless and mechanical, and to the point where he tries to become a little bit more soulful, well, he can't really sell it, either as a vocalist or in terms of arranging his instrumentation. Now, don't get me wrong, if he was just staying in a purely electronic mold, that'd be fine. Like, there's a place for that colder, more methodical composition, even coming into some points of free jazz. But this album in particular is going for a lot more R&B and soul vibes with smatterings of funk, specifically calling back to an 80s sound, and I have to be blunt, this album just does not sell it all that well for me. For one, you have this typical problem of Jacob Collier's delivery. He comes across as a classical crooner, but minus all the theatricality that would make those guys coming out of the 50s and 60s really impressive. And the way he layers his vocals and stacks them so neatly, he invites no opportunity for organic soul or texture to come through them. And that means when you're pairing him opposite vocalists who are a little bit more textured and expressive, like a T-Pain or a Daniel Caesar or a Ty Dolla $ign or even a Tori Kelly, well, he comes across as kind of sterile, as an inert presence in the mix, and that does become distracting. And I'll go even further here. Even when you have the moments where he's trying to create a composition that will bounce around and have some of that jittery, loose funk to it, it always comes across as just a bit too locked into its own niche, that it doesn't allow itself to open up and actually allow people to dance effectively to it. It's locking into all those tight, bouncy grooves that show the obvious and flagrant Flying Lotus influence, but none of the danceable impulses that would make Flying Lotus's slower songs actually compelling. Even when I want to say that he's got a lot of that technical craftsmanship that will come through in the compositions, it doesn't really carry over to the writing. Of course, he tries to rap on this thing, and it's got the layered, tight, multi-syllabic construction you would expect, but beyond that, he's not really saying much of anything. A lot of these songs default to some pretty basic love songs, then quasi-breakup songs, a lot of which have the subtext of, oh, I'm going to focus on my genius. I need to continue having that level of focus on creating high art that will transcend this. It's not particularly fun, nor accessible, nor populist, and that kind of seems to run that contrary purpose to what you would expect in more of a pop concept. Really, without some of that organic warmth and texture,
I don't really buy into the R&B or soul moments either. What's even worse is he's got a few moments where he tries to go for electronic elements that bring in elements of dubstep or a more glitchy, almost trap-inspired interlude, and he flubs them completely. You can tell he's trying to get a little bit rougher, a little bit more shaky, a little bit more unstable, but the problem with that is, once again, coming down with production. At least a lot of those songs, even when they are incompetently mixed and mastered, they have a sense of groove. They've got a sense of where things are actually driving towards. There's texture here, whereas Jacob Collier's attempt at texture just sounds blown out and really sterile and somehow even worse. At the end of the day, look, I can appreciate this guy. I understand the technical craftsmanship. Again, I can admire someone who's got the skill to create these sort of compositions and then play all the instruments on the songs. That's impressive. And there are good moments where he gets out of the way and lets guest stars kind of deliver on some good compositions. I thought Kimbra sounded okay here. Ty Dolla $ign always sounds good. I thought Rhapsody's verse was actually pretty solid. She comes here and does effectively what she needs to do. But again, it's missing that soulful warmth and texture that would really set this above and apart and beyond. And honestly, that's kind of what's held me back from really embracing Jacob Collier as the genius that so many of his fans hype him up to be, especially when you dig even a little bit deeper into experimental music. He's not doing that much that Flying Lotus, Thundercat, Anna Meredith, Patricia Taxon, and a lot of other composers are doing, but with a greater sense for song construction, groove, or a soulful amount of texture and warmth in the mixes that can be more enticing. Hell, I'd argue that Anna Meredith, even going pop on her last album, managed to capture a lot of this way more effectively, and she has as good, if not better, compositional chops. So with all that in mind, I do feel this album is heavily flawed. As much as I can respect the composition, it's not something I'm going to go back to, and the duds I really didn't like. At the same time, it does have enough decent moments, so I'm going to err on the side of being a little more positive and give it an extremely light 6 out of 10. If this is your thing, I don't begrudge you this. Everyone needs an entry point to this style of experimental music, but it's not for me. And I guarantee that if you dig even a little bit deeper, Jacob Collier's sound, while tasteful, is not all that special. Just saying.
Now I know there's nothing I can't do.